One of the things that I thought that I would address, since I think the initial idea for the series has a lot to do with integration of our disciplines with our faith. And when we get to the area of creation care, I thought I would tell you my story. Some of you know I've been around here since the earth cooled. Actually, if I were still teaching first time, this would be my 41st year. I taught for 38 years full time. And so I want to sort of tell you a bit about my experience in this area of what we now call creation care. In the secular vernacular, I think you would call it environmentalism. But I want to sort of help you see where I came from. So let's see. There we go. I want to tell you a bit about the kinds of images that affected me and kind of helped form a bit of my psyche, a bit of my understanding of the world, and then help you see how that related to what happened to me at Biola. So I grew up as a kid spending my summers on my grandfather Big Rafe's farm in eastern Oregon. And Big Rafe was an amazing man. Only had an 8th grade education, but he knew the earth. He lived the earth. He lived off of the earth. And so I learned early what it meant to live close to the earth and depend on it, literally, for, where are we going? Are we going? There we go. Depend on it for your livelihood. And something's not working too well, Gary. Do I need to push this on the side?
Push it down. Down. Like this.
Oh, okay, there we go. All right. And so my grandfather, as a remarkable Christian, devout man, really learned to depend on the Lord for basically the harvest. And I can even remember years that they had so little that they only had enough to put away for seed for the next year and canned goods for the coming year and things like that. But certainly living sort of sustainable before sustainable was in. And today, sustainable living is one of the sort of catchphrases. So I just wanted to say I've been a Christian for most of my life, over 60 years. And I went to a Christian college, I went to a Christian high school. I married a nice conservative Christian girl. She doesn't happen to be here right now. She's home teaching. But married into a very conservative Christian family, came from a conservative Christian family. My parents were missionaries. I was born in Africa. I am an African American, by the way. I got my master's degree at the University of Nebraska and then started a PhD at UC Santa Barbara, finishing it many years later back at the University of Nebraska. So in the 60s and into the early 70s, you might recall, some of you weren't around at that time, might recall that we had a war going on in Asia, and it was virtually the first war that was on television. And you could see what happened on virtually almost a nightly basis, what was happening. And while I was in graduate school, I have these images literally in my mind, even still, of B-52s dropping bombs and helicopters spraying Agent Orange on pristine forests and on rice paddies. And so that really began to get to me in terms of what was going on with this environment. And at the same time, In 1969, some of you might have recalled that there was an oil spill in Santa Barbara, of all places to have an oil spill on the pristine beaches of Santa Barbara. Not a good place to have that happen. But I can remember seeing oil-covered beaches. That kind of sound familiar, remembering something even far more devastating in the past year. Oil-covered birds, that happens all the time when an oil spill happens. And then even the workers covered with oil. And in those days, the only way to clean it up was to throw bales of hay in the beach and then, rake in the straw. But that really affected me as well, just seeing that happen really in my own backyard while I was in grad school there before I came to Biola. And so I became very disillusioned. I became very polarized, radicalized, if you will. I became a pacifist. I became a war protester. That's a photograph of the burning of the Bank of America in Isla Vista, and I was out there at that time. And I can tell you what tear gas is like. Not fun. But, when I told my students that I'd gotten tear gas being a war protester, it was like, oh my goodness, how did he get to Biola? But I got involved in some of the very first kinds of environmental green things that were going on. I even brought with me my copy of Every Man's Guide to Ecological Living, probably the very first how-to live ecologically book that was published, and a group of us graduate students at UCSB published that in 1970. And that was really who I was in this part of the discipline. I was working on a doctorate that studied fishes in the ocean. And I was taking many biological science courses. And so I was hired to come to Biola. And sort of that was my experience, right? And it's become even more of our experience. I think the air may be a little cleaner, but the freeway traffic is a little worse. But I came in 1970, just months after the oil spill in Santa Barbara and the burning of the bank. And I came knowing full well what Biola was, what it stood for. And that was part of who I was as well, my upbringing. But understanding and knowing that Christians in particular had very little interest in caring for creation. That wasn't the term we used in those days, but very little interest in it. And in fact, I met extreme resistance to that message in my classrooms, and when I would go to college groups and churches, etc., it was like running into a brick wall. I really heard statements like this: why do we need to care for creation? There's just too many souls that need to be saved. And the earth's going to burn up anyway, so why should we even bother? And here's the take-home lesson for this. I didn't know Scripture well enough. I didn't know, in a sense, I really didn't even know to search it carefully enough, and there was little written in that area to help me integrate my faith and what I understood creation was about and caring for it and why we should. Francis Schaeffer had come out with a book in 1970, Pollution and the Death of Man, kind of a Christian view of ecology. And that was probably the very first one that ever came out that had a Christian bent to it. And since then, I know Gary and I both have libraries that, 20, 30 books that deal with this subject matter. But it took quite a long time for that material to get out to the Christians. And the environment didn't get any better. Creation didn't get any cleaner, or Christians didn't get any more involved in a very long time. And so I'm ashamed to say, but for many years, virtually about 30 years at Biola, I quit talking in public about this issue. I didn't have the tools and the skill, and I didn't have the camaraderie in the faculty that would have supported me in this area. That's what's so good about what we do here now. Rick, this is really important. Everybody in any other discipline, this is really important. You need to take this information to your other colleagues and say, you know, there are great resources in your discipline to help you in integrating your faith into your discipline and teaching so that the students themselves can grasp the fact that our faith infuses all of our lives. It's not just the Bible. It's not just Talbot. That's the start, that's the foundation. So that was really important for me, that I didn't have and that later on I gained. And how did I sort of have a reawakening? Well, about 10 years ago, I read Stephen Bauer Prediger's book, For the Beauty of the Earth, the first book I had ever read that really, from a theological standpoint, looked at creation care. A deep theological look at it, and it was life-changing. There was even I can even say one verse that really, when he exegeted it, I wondered, how in the world did I miss this? And that really, really helped me. Then I also got to meet Cal DeWitt, and he's the author of Earthwise, but a great man who founded the Sabo Institute for the Environmental Studies in Michigan and then in the Pacific Rim up on Whidbey Island. And I've had the opportunity to interact with a lot of other Christian college biology teachers and ecology teachers and environmental science professors from across the country and understand how they've gone through the similar kind of journey. So that's to say how we got to here. Now, it was late in my career at Biola, and fortunately, over the last 10 years of my career, at least, I was able to integrate that into more of my teaching and bring other colleagues in, and I love having Dan here. Dan and I are very close friends, and I had the privilege of bringing art students down to Baja for our interterm class that we used to offer down there, and see the world through different eyes. The way I looked at the earth, the way I looked at creation was way different than an artist would look at it. But I kept going down there and saying, this place needs to be painted. And this place needs to be photographed. And it needs to be documented in a way that other people can appreciate this part of creation. And it's a little bit more pristine than it is here in the Los Angeles area. But that gave me a chance to start this dialogue. So Dan and I had this dialogue for 10 years prior to when I retired. So that's kind of where we got to, okay? Now, so this is kind of a thing that Gary and I would like to sort of bounce back and forth here, and that has to do with the kinds of things, the stumbling blocks that we find in our working with and talking with other Christians, even in my own church recently as 3 years ago, these kinds of comments, okay? So Gary, you can jump in too if you want, okay? So this is like, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. I mean, we sing the song, you know. People really don't have a sense of ownership or at least stewardship of the earth because we're just transitory. And that tends to be a real strong statement that comes out when you talk to Christians. And maybe you yourself might feel that same way. Why should I care? I'm only here for a short time, okay? Or that caring for creation might get a little too close to worshiping creation, or being a little new agey, you know. It has certainly some real strong political overtones these days, and we don't want to be identified with that liberal side of things. Some of us don't. This left-wing political kind of approach.
If the Democrats like it, we shouldn't.
Yeah. And I don't mind saying I'm a registered Democrat. No, you could have figured that one out too, right? So Dave Peters and I think that's about it here on campus, right, Dave? Maybe there's a few more now. Okay, 3. Okay. And students look at you going, "How can you be?" You know, so isn't that sort of Anyway, Satan's world. Or I just don't want to be an alarmist, you know. I don't want to get really, you know, into this kind of tied up or bound up with something that's so kind of an extremist, alarmist point of view. And my approach now is certainly much less extremist, but much more involvement, okay? And then the classic that we can sort of reinterpret here at Biola, you know, people are more important than the environment, or as I found early on, I am all about saving souls and less about, you know, caring for the earth, you know. And now it's, which is really neat with the School of Intercultural Studies, is that we've got individuals teaching missions that approach it from a completely different approach than what I learned as a child growing up in Africa. Well, I didn't grow up, but anyway, being in Africa and seeing the way my parents 65 years or more ago approached missions is way different than we approach missions now. And so meeting a person's physical needs, you know, go right hand in glove with meeting a person's spiritual needs. And you can't really feed a soul until you feed a belly, actually, in a lot of ways, you know, and care for their health, their own personal health, before you can actually minister to them in their souls and help them understand what the beauty of having Christ as part of their lives. So those are kinds of the kinds of things that continually pop up, and there are plenty of others. Maybe you will reflect on that as well. So why should we care for creation? This is going to be part of our evangelical message here. Why should we care for creation? And again, Biola Prediger puts in his book at least 10 reasons. But Gary and I thought we'd put in about 6 or 7 that kind of connect. This one, you know, if you breathe, thank a tree. The biological processes of photosynthesis and the idea that, of course, green things produce the oxygen that we breathe. And the more green things we have out there that are living, and not on St. Patrick's Day, but the green living things, they produce pure oxygen for us, and it's important to have them in good supply. And so the other concept kind of goes along with, and that's we're all in this together, and as much as you may dislike Al Gore, if you'd ever watched his award-winning film, you would remember that he starts off with a picture of the Earth taken by the astronauts when they had gone to the moon and looked back at the Earth for the first time, and really seen how, in a sense, insignificant the planet Earth is. It really does go back to Scripture. And when we consider the Earth, and then when we consider man on the Earth, how insignificant we may really seem in the big scheme of things, and yet God loves us. That's the thing that he didn't say. That's the thing that we should be saying, though. We should be saying he loves us. It's about him. It's about caring for his earth. And that when you look at the earth from space, that you don't see the boundaries, the political boundaries. You don't see the national boundaries. You see a planet on which people live. And so we are all in this together. Another one, and this is a personal testimony here too, that the earth is on loan to us from our children. Multiple times in my ecology classes over 35 years, I would ask my students, are you upset that the earth that you're going to inherit is in worse shape than the one I got? And I must tell you that rarely, if ever, students even thought about it. Rarely, if ever, they were concerned. And that bothered me. I needed to then help them, at least at the classroom level, understand the nature of why things were getting worse and how it was that we were responsible for caring for it. And then the idea, and this I read first in Schaeffer's book, having to do with the value of creation, of the created order. That if God, through Christ, deemed everything created good, gave it value, then the duty comes with that. And that value that generates duty in terms of caring for it, because we are then responsible for carrying something that has value in and of itself, okay? And then for the beauty of the earth, and this is one of Calvin's, John Calvin's great themes, that he really felt that it was important to give praise back to God for the beauty of the created order. And is that it? Oh, yeah. And then, of course, the best for the last, right? Why care for creation? Because God says so. I mean, you can go through Scripture starting from Genesis 1:28 or 2:15, and you can go from there. And God says, care for it, tend it, protect it. And we should be doing that. Okay, Gary's on.
I was a math and computer science major. If it moved, it was chemistry. If it moved, it was biology. If it smelled, it was chemistry. I stayed away from that stuff. So in terms of the science of biology, ecology, and so on, I'd have very little interest in that. But as you might have guessed from the screensaver slides, I grew up climbing, hiking, backpacking, being in nature. I grew up in a rural area south of Seattle. I could go up 3 houses and follow a creek all the way to Puget Sound and spend the whole day out there on the beach skin diving. So it was just natural for me, growing up in that environment, growing up as a Christian, to read the Bible and appreciate the nature psalms, appreciate the references to nature. And it just seemed natural to me to look for theological reasons, to find theological reasons, to care about creation. I was a little surprised then in the 70s at some of the backlash to Francis Schaeffer's book. I was disappointed to see that. We were... My mic's not on? Is this better? Am I there? Hello? Okay, thank you. I thought I was projecting. Well, I was disappointed at the backlash, at some of the reasons that people would give for not caring about creation, because it seemed intuitive to me. When I began my doctoral work in philosophy, I'd anticipated doing a dissertation in environmental ethics. The very first thing I did was an independent study on theological aspects of environmental ethics. I wrote about a 120-page monograph. The article that's on the website is a condensation of much of that. I found that it wasn't well accepted even at the University of Colorado, because the guy in charge of the environmental ethics program was a Gaia hypothesis guy, worshiped Mother Earth. And he didn't like the theological aspect that I put on it. So I wound up not doing environmental ethics, but still working on the theological grounding. So let me just do a little bit of that here. In general terms, the term that we usually use is stewardship, where a steward is the person left in charge of the master's estate while the master is absent. And so the steward has responsibilities for the care of the estate. He's responsible not to the estate, but to the master. And if he doesn't care about the estate, if he doesn't care about the beautiful Wedgwood china, if he doesn't care about the rose garden, he still has to care for it and value it because the master values it. So it's that concept of stewardship that we see in nature. And I think some of the root ideas are these. Creation entails ownership. God owns nature. God owns creation. Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Since it was created by God, it can reveal something of his character, just as any work of art intentionally produced by an artist reveals something of that artist. Nature reveals something of God's character. I don't think it's salvific knowledge. I want to be clear about that. But it does reveal something of God. The heavens do declare the glory of God. And the skies, the firmament, proclaims the work of his hands. Nature can be used by God, since it's his possession. It can be used by God for blessing or for punishment. Psalm 78 is just one place where we see verse after verse of God using the natural processes to bless and to punish. But going back to Genesis, right in verse 1, Genesis 1:28, right after God created man in his image, male and female, he created them, then God blessed them. This is the context of blessing. And he said, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over it. Have dominion over it. The ideas then of subduing and ruling have to do with a royal or a kingly duty. This is our function as stewards on behalf of the king. This is our royal function, to subdue and to rule. We are representatives of God as his vice regents in nature. The words subdue and rule are harsh words. Sometimes rulership needs to be harsh, but they don't endorse the rape of the earth. They don't endorse using up resources with no thought of what's ahead. The ruling and subduing must be done. The dominion must be exercised with the view of the value of the Creator who put us in charge of it. These functions designate jurisdiction and responsibility, not rights. You can jump in too if you like. Here. Genesis 2:15, the Lord planted a garden, and he put Adam in the garden to work it and keep it, the NIV says. Some translations say to cultivate it and till it. The Hebrew words avad and shamar are very interesting. They are used, when they're used together, they're almost always used in the context of the priest's duty. This is what the priests did in the tabernacle and in the temple. They served and they guarded. The early rabbis picked up on that, and they understood that these words communicated a priestly duty. That idea got lost in much of history. In 1949, a Jewish commentator, Umberto Cassuto, picked it up again in his commentary. And in recent years, we find it in evangelical commentaries by John Walton, John Sailhammer, John Wenham, and so on, that this is our priestly function. We have a role as an intermediary between God and man, not representing God to creation, not in a sacrificial or redemptive sense, but in the role of the priests in the tabernacle to keep the sacred space clean and holy and set apart from pollution.
Another thing I think interesting about this concept of priesthood, we forget that in Hebrews it talks about a priesthood of believers. And how many of us really take seriously the idea that we are priests and priestly in that regard? And I don't think it crosses our mind very often as evangelicals.
We usually think of the priesthood simply in terms of our ability to pray without going through a priest. Yeah. We don't have to make confession before taking communion to a priest. But it's a much broader concept. And certainly, as we watch the development in the Pentateuch, the role of the priest is primarily the function of working in the temple. The role of the Levites was to teach. The role of the priests was to guard the sacred space and be sure that the rituals of worship were carried out properly. I think that's what that says. Yeah. So the idea of stewardship, Douglas John Hall said that stewardship belongs to the most ancient strands of the Judeo-Christian heritage. And so the scriptures do offer us today, as well as the developing Christian movement in the first centuries, a particularly interesting metaphor through which we can glimpse something of the whole thrust and meaning of the message and of the purpose of our life in the world. The steward values what the master values, values just as the master values. Some things in the natural world are more valuable than others. Much of secular environmental ethics puts everything on a par. We won't do that. Understanding our role as stewards before God, we value as God values. There are differences of value. But we need to manage the estate in the manner the master would want it managed, according to his values, if he were here. 3 aspects. Restoration. By the way, if you pick up a typical textbook on environmental ethics, or one of the anthologies that are out there and articles written, they will often divide it into these 3 aspects. And it's interesting how these ring so true to what we see in Genesis. There's restoration, because nature is imperfect. The garden needed tending. The garden was not autonomous.
And I think a lot of us forget that so often we think the garden was perfect, and in some regards it was, but in other regards, it required Adam and Eve to tend it, to care for it. I mean, in a sense, the definition of a garden is something planted, and it says God planted the garden. And then the tending of it, it needed to be cared for.
And beyond that, there was a world outside the garden that would try to encroach upon the garden. And so there needed to be a protection of this space. Francis Schaeffer used the term substantial healing. As we look not just at the garden, but at the world over which we are stewards, we can bring about substantial healing as part of our cultural mandate. We're not going to bring about the new heavens and the new earth, but we can bring about substantial healing. So the aspect of restoration fits in well with our mandate to subdue and rule and have dominion. Then there's conservation, because nature is finite. We can't use, it's like our bank accounts, right? The idea of sustainability applies to our stewardship of creation as well as to our stewardship of our time and our finances. And finally, preservation, because nature is valuable. There are areas that we need to preserve just because God made them that way. And visiting wilderness is restorative. There's a recreation of our souls that can occur in wild settings that doesn't occur in rural or urban settings. So we need wild lands and wildlife. So we had a lot of thoughts about how we could apply these ideas. And we thought about some of the disciplines of stewardship of creation. Certainly biology, botany, ecology, environmental studies. These are crucial, and I'm glad to see Biola has moved stronger in this way, bringing in Mark to do the environmental sciences.
If you haven't met soon-to-be Dr. Mark McReynolds, Mark is our new professor of environmental science. And sort of the last thing that I did in leaving Biola was help create this new major. And we had the privilege of bringing Mark in. And his lovely wife, Karen, is here as well. And so he's kind of our go-to guy. And we're hoping this department and this major will continue to grow. But certainly in environmental studies, but it goes beyond that. Go ahead, Gary.
About 3 years ago, I guess, Rafe and I, together with John Bloom and Brent Ridley, taught a class in environmental ethics. And what was really great about that was integrating the physics, the chemistry, the biology, the theology, and the ethics in a single course. And I know that Mark wants to do that sort of thing with his environmental sciences major. Physics, chemistry, engineering, the new Talbot building over there has a number of features that are environmentally friendly, more than any other building on campus, and I think that's important, not just as an object lesson, but it's important for us to be involved in doing something like that. Of course, medical science, part of subduing and having dominion is controlling disease and helping cure, prevent disease. But then the liberal arts come in here strongly, I think.
Well, certainly, and with my experience with Dan, for example, I could really understand a lot more about how in a sense, the art student, if not sort of the other students, those with really interesting creative minds, could gain from a step out into nature and investigating it, both from my eyes and point of view, but then again for them to really assert their own selves within that discipline. And so that was a remarkable way to at least get a little bit of interdisciplinary kinds of things. But as far as literature is concerned, the literary world is replete with great natural history literature, nature literature. You can get Christian influences in Wendell Berry, but there are just all kinds of other really good stuff out there, going back to Aldo Leopold, and going clear. going clear up to today, John Janevi and others who are writing, caring for the earth, and some from a Christian perspective and others not, but it certainly gives a rich wealth of literature. Steinbeck stuff from the Sea of Cortez is really rich with observations from a writer who got an opportunity to follow a great marine biologist through Baja and discover, he wasn't calling it creation, but they were discovering for the first time, naming for the first time, organisms that really are there, And so even in the area, and you can obviously think in many of your other disciplines, where you can get involved with and engage in caring for and documenting the nature of nature. And photography certainly stands out there as one of the ways that you can see it. But I think one of the things that Gary has talked about is environmental ethics. And just meeting Stuart for the first time and knowing we've got a lawyer amongst us, there's a whole body of information of environmental law that we are responsible for at least addressing and obeying, that we have here in our own lands, whether we agree with where some of that's going or not, but there is environmental law. And one of the things we would love to see happen in our environmental science major is to get an environmental policy and law class that the students could understand the kinds of regulations that are out there that help at least our communities deal with some of these issues.
What we've been trying to suggest are some theological principles, how they relate to, especially the natural sciences, how they relate to integration. Certainly there's personal application too. We just don't have time to get into that, but I hope you all leave here and recycle. Pogo got it right. Back in 1970, Walt Kelly. We all know the bottom panel in this cartoon. We often don't realize the context of that famous Pogo slogan.
And that was a cartoon that came out for the very first Earth Day in 1970, so 40 years ago. But we have met the enemy and he are us. And we are the cause for much of the demise that we see here, and we could be the cause for much of the restoration. And I leave with a sense of hope and a sense of victory, knowing, one, that my Redeemer has not only redeemed me, but he is redeeming his creation. He will reconcile all things back to himself in the end. And so that's a message of hope that goes just beyond the salvation of our souls, that our students and ourselves really need to be owning at all times, so that we don't become naysayers. We don't become discouraged, as I was early on, about trying to get a message there. But the true message is, it will be reconciled. There will be heaven on earth. And that will be a marvelous new Jerusalem, a marvelous new creation. I'm already a new creation. You are. But this earth that we're living on is also going to be that as well. I don't believe it's just going to be destroyed and something completely new. I think he really says through Scripture that he is interested in his creation. It was good. It will be even better. It'll be good again when he reconciles it all back to himself. So I think we're ready for questions, all right?
One final thought. We haven't said a thing about global warming.
Is it
The case that I would make theologically and philosophically for the care of creation is independent of any environmental crisis. That's a responsibility no matter what we think about global warming, about the degree of anthropogenic causes of global warming. But we should remember that environmental degradation always hits the poorest of the poor the hardest. And Scripture clearly shows us that God has a deep concern for the poor.
Yeah, that's another really key, critical point to remember, that the poor suffer the most when there's environmental degradation. And one only needs to look at the neighborhoods around hazardous waste dumps, to see the standard of living there. But in other countries it exists as well. So it's a responsibility we do have. We would love to, hear some thoughts and comments. Back in the back first.
Human beings were created in the image of God. The second person of the Trinity became incarnate as a human being. There's a value to humans that is different than anything else in creation. And much of environmental ethics tries to pull humanity down to the level of the chimpanzee or the flatworm. Now, in terms of the gulf between creator and creature, we're certainly on the side of the earthworm. But in terms of value and being the image bearer of God, we're on God's side. So we value people over nature. But that doesn't mean we don't value nature. And there are parts of nature that we would value more highly than others. There are areas that cry out for preservation because of the great biodiversity. And we ought to try to prevent the destruction of rainforests, the destruction of rich ecosystems. We ought to value that just because of the beauty and the diversity that God created. There's a lot more that could be said specifically. This probably isn't the time or the place to do it, but those are some of the sorts of principles I think we could apply, Andrew.
I think, to go along with what Gary said, it doesn't have to be an either or. It doesn't have to be either we value humans or we value the earth or created order. In fact, in many instances, if you don't give value and stewardship to the earth, then you don't allow for the value of the human being who's living on it and who has to be sustained by it. And I think that's a real important issue as well. I used to get stumped by that, okay, we value humans far over the environment, so why should we care for the environment? We've got to care for humans. And it really doesn't have to be an either or. Well, the first thing, it stunted my growth, okay? See, I am standing up, see? Well, one, I do say, as I did there, that I am ashamed that I backed away. I didn't back away in the classroom, but in terms of the evangel of it, in terms of the evangelical nature that I was trying to, when I came to Biola, trying to engage the rest of the campus, for example, that was something I held private to myself. And it was and it has been a struggle. And there are faculty here who will remember what it was like to have a university, at that time a college, in which we had a Bible department in undergraduate, and we had Talbot Theological Seminary with a whole nother Bible faculty there. And the two, in a sense, didn't talk. That was indicative of the kind of separation, in a sense, we had. It wasn't church and state, but it was certainly a separation that existed and almost fostered a different private life than what, and private thoughts, than what was really being purported to be taught university-wide or college-wide. So the only thing I can say, and thank you for saying it was growth, because that's really what happened, was I was encouraged several times along the way, meeting individuals, and then eventually really had an epiphany when I read Stephen's book. It had to do with really the exegesis of just one verse, and that was 2 Peter 3:10. And I don't know why I didn't look at it before. It was convicting, and it's recognized, and that's another thing you all need to remember, that you can be honest before your students. and help them understand that spiritual growth should be occurring and does occur throughout your entire life. But it was very convicting to be able to go back and realize that I had let decades go where I wasn't growing spiritually in my discipline. And in the biological sciences, it tended to be easier to get engaged in the discussion of creation evolution, because that's what almost every parent was asking us as they were thinking about sending their kids here, and less about caring for creation. And so in some ways, the biological sciences became sort of, in terms of controversy, really unidimensional. And we really had, I discover, of course, that we really should have had far more to say about far more, a broader variety of things. So I'm still growing. And I don't mind saying that. I mean, I really don't mind saying that. I don't think that my psyche is overly damaged. I think I'm fairly confident with who I am in the Lord. And yeah, I'll tell you one thing. I really do wish, all things considered, if I had my health back, I really do wish I could start over again right now. Today at Biola, under the conditions that we have here at Biola, our faculty, our administration, our student body, compared to what it was like 40 years ago. And it wasn't bad 40 years ago, it was just different. We are theologically the same institution. And I can say that with confidence because I've been here for 40 years. But we are different when it comes to the makeup of who we are. We're far more collegial. We're far more accepting of each other, and that we're far more diverse, which is so, so good. You know.
Let me conclude here if I can, because Rick's about ready to interrupt us. This book, this is the one that Rafe has referred to. I've used it as text as well, Stephen Bauman Predinger, For the Beauty of the Earth. If you don't want to read something that long, my paper on the website is only 30 pages. There's two web links, one to the Cornwall Alliance, which is much more Republican, I guess you could say, much less concerned about environmental issues. The other is the Evangelical Environmental Network. You can look at both of those. There's something for someone of every political stripe. But no matter where we are politically, it seems to me there's a biblical case to be made. We just touched the surface of it for creation care.
Let me say thank you to Rafe and Gary for